Hello and welcome to your language part 2 notes. In our last notes we talked about just a little bit what language is, how it's broken down sound-wise and grammatically speaking, so the rules that we apply. And in these notes we're going to talk about development. So how does language change throughout development, so from being a baby to adults. You need to know the milestones of language development. And by milestones you mean the age and then what type of speech happens, and you'll also need to know examples of that type of speech. There's a chart coming up later you need to copy down, but also just know what happens at each stage of language. You also need to take away that language can happen differently for different children. So the milestones that were given at ages aren't always the exact age, but they are generally the ones that are tested on in your on your AP test. Okay, so let's talk about language, how it changes from when you're born, being a baby, to when you get to be a toddler, to elementary school age, and further than that. So there's two different types of language you need to know. There's receptive language and there's productive language. Let's see if it goes over here. So receptive language and productive language. Before you frantically start writing this down, think about what does it mean to be receiving or receptive? What does it mean to produce? And that will help you understand the difference between these two. So receptive language goes from very simple to complex as we develop. And it's our ability to comprehend speech. And we are able to receive language or have receptive language much earlier in age than we are to be able to produce it. So children is as small as like 6 months, even 5, or like down the development line, like to like 2, 3, 4 months, they like the faces match speech. Meaning that even though they're not understanding perhaps what is said, they like that when like an O sound is made, that it's coming out of face that matches that speech. They're able to match it up. So they'll actually look at the face that is matched with the speech, meaning that the words are coming out of the mouth in the same shape as they sound. So that we're much more prone to receive language at an early age than we are to produce language. And so your productive language is when you're able to actually produce words, to talk. This is different from just making sounds. So think about language again, and our definition of language, remember, is that it's written, spoken, or signed. So at a young age, language is able, if we're communicating to someone else, we're not able to be productive with language at a young age. So productive language comes a little bit later, when we're able to produce words. Most of the time that's probably going to be verbally, but there's also some really good techniques you can use with smaller children as far as signing for things that they want. So now let's look at our productive language milestones. So pause this, write it down, and make sure you know everything. You need to know these 4 vocab words. You need to know the month that's associated with them, and then the speech. So you might be given an example, and you need to know the example of it. So the very first stage of productive language is something called babbling. And think about if someone's babbling on, it means like they're kind of going on and on. But babbling, like Miss Myers is babbling right now. Babbling, as far as productive language, is considered uttered speech. It's not an imitation of what's going on around them. It's just like as young as 4 months, children start making sounds like ga, goo, right? That's kind of like the typical sounds that or the prototyped sounds that we associate with children. They're not imitating anything. So even without language being spoken around babies, they still are able to do this babbling stage. And at 10 months old, people who come into the house and listen to babies, because of the different sounds that are being made, can identify the language of the house even without ever hearing words. So the babbling stage tends to, as you get older, mock the tones of the house. And there's different, if you go back a couple notes, there's different morphemes and then the phonemes of each language. So we said the English language has 40 of them. They're distinct per the language. So at this 10-month age, in the babbling stage, you're actually able to identify, if you walked into a household of a baby, what language is spoken in that household. And then the next 2 I think are pretty easy to remember, because the 1 stage begins at about 1, which is 12 months, and the 2-word stage starts at about 2, which is 24 months. So the 1-word stage is a very, it's easy to remember. It's the first word. So these are things like mom, dad, bye-bye, right? So like one word, cat, dog, very easy to remember, like these very simple words. A two-word stage occurs about 2 years old. And this is where they're putting two words together, which is usually a noun and a verb. Like car go, or go car, or mom up, right? So putting two words together, what I want you to do, and then who I'm directing this to. These at 18 months though, they're still in a very big receptive stage. It's shown that they're about a new word per day. Not that they're saying, but that they can understand and learn. They're not saying a new word each day. And by 2 years old, that's our two-word sentences. And that's called telegraphic speech. So you need to know that two-word stage, 2 years old, telegraphic speech. And it's called telegraphic speech because telegraphs, in the olden days when you had to pay to send a message over distance, it would say things like train Sunday, right? So like two things just put together, telegraphic, two short words put together but it still conveys semantics. I still get the meaning of those two words put together. Go car means that like I want the car to go. Mom up means pick me up. So two-word stage, you're able to get meaning or semantics without necessarily the syntax or the rules that apply. All right, so here's the chart I want you to write down. Take a second to just draw this chart. This is the summary of language development. You're looking at the month and the stage that goes with it. So at the age of 4 months, this is when the babble speech. They babble many speech sounds, doesn't necessarily imitate language, but it's going off of you can usually tell what household language is spoken. 10 months, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. So the 4 month, you can't tell the household. By 10 months, you can look at the babbling that resembles the household. Now I really am babbling. 12 months is my one-word stage. 24 is my two-word telegraphic. And then 24 plus is really this rapid language development where language goes from being two-word telegraphic to complete sentences and really producing language at a much faster rate than they're learning it. So it's an interesting stage where the 2-year-old is able to start putting together sentences that they've never heard before. Examples of that, being able to say like, Daddy, I don't like you. A 2-year-old might have heard I don't like you before and knows the word daddy, but when they're able to put those two things together, that is really showing a different type of speech because they've never heard the words together, daddy, I don't like you, but they're able to produce that without ever hearing it. Okay? So now that we know the relative stages of language acquisition, it's time to talk about why the different theories about how we learn language or why we learn language. So we're going to repeat or come back to this issue of nature versus nurture with language acquisition. So how do we learn the language around us? And you need to know these two people, so B.F. Skinner and Chomsky, and then what they believed and how we acquire language. So the first one we're going to look at is Skinner, which we've already talked about Skinner with his operant condition. So Skinner, B.F. Skinner, wanted to explain language development in the terms of operant learning. Go back and think about what operant learning is. Remember, I'm reinforcing behavior that I want to see while I am punishing behavior that I want to decrease. So reinforcement increases behavior, punishment decreases. So think about this with language. If I'm a child learning language and I want to reinforce that language, think about the first time, if you have any kids in your house or nephews or nieces, the first time a child says a word, there's the immediate, yay, like you said, daddy, good job, right? There's smiles, there's laughter, there's happiness. That is a reinforcement. Now that child is more likely to say that word again. Okay, so the learning principles of operant learning is the one I just talked about, the reinforcement. So the positive, saying like reinforcing the language by smiles or praise or whatever the kid wants. So if they're pointing to something going and they say, what do you want? Use your words. And they say milk, you would reinforce it by giving them milk, right? So you're giving them milk, it's going to reinforce that when they say milk, they get something to drink. Now, association principles, this might be a little bit different. You want to take some notes to the side. Association is just observation. So the child observes that when I point to the tree and I say tree, so they're associating, mom pointed to the tree and she said tree. Those two things are probably interrelated. And then that can be reinforced. The child points to the tree and I say, yes, good job, that's a tree, right? So associating two objects and then having reinforcement on it. And then imitation is a child's tendency to imitate things that they hear. So kids are really good at this, good and bad, imitating things that they hear. And again, those imitations can be reinforced. So, oh gosh, what is one of my son's favorite sayings? Like, oh, that's just a lot to do, right? So he's just imitating me saying like, oh, that's just a lot, too much to do. And then I reinforce it by laughing because I think it's hilarious when he says it, especially when he says it like me. And so that's reinforcing him saying it again. So Skinner believed operant learning is the key to language development. They hear things, they associate, they imitate, and then it's reinforced either positive or negative. If I called the tree a dog, right? So if I said dog, that wouldn't be reinforced and not necessarily punish it, but I'd say, no, that's not a dog, so I'm withholding smiles or I'm withholding praise. Okay, so that would definitely be the nurture, the environment bringing up the language. Versus my nature is going to be Chomsky. And Chomsky thought that it was more of an inborn universal grammar, that language development was more like helping a flower grow along its way, but it's still going to be a flower. He thought that the nature side of it, that we are pre-wired with language in our brains, and that as these natural milestones come apart, that we're shaped maybe a little bit one way or another, but we're going to develop that language nonetheless. And he said that, and his evidence for this is something of universal grammar. So looking at all the different languages, they tend to have nouns and verbs and adjectives at very young ages. Those are the first things they pick up on. And he said that must be something that we're pre-wired with, to pick up on nouns first, dog, tree, cat, then to pick up on verbs like go, up, and then adjectives later. So he said no matter what the language, it has the same type of development, and that whether you're learning Spanish or French or English or German, we tend to pick up on nouns first and then verbs and then adjectives. So that was his idea of universal grammar. There's the same pre-wired language acquisition. So Chomsky is going to be our huge nature guy, okay? Now, has it been answered one way or the other? Not really. Maybe it's a combination of both. Are we hardwired and we need that nurture, the reinforcement? There's been a lot of studies done with children that were horrifically raised without language around them, with no language or not even sign language, and looking at their development. So they're very far behind on reading and writing and language if they've never been exposed to it. So maybe there is this combination between both. All right, and then the last thing we're going to talk about in these notes is language development as far as critical periods and statistical learning. So critical periods, we'll go to those first, or sensitive periods. Those seems to be the period of time when children must be exposed to language in order to keep it for the rest of their life. So the critical period for acquiring the first language, learning a second language, is right before 7 years old. So it is better to learn a second language before you turn 7, because that's when a lot of the learning does. There's actually been a big push to move all our second languages to elementary school. And that is the critical sensitive period, is that's the period of time where it's most important that the language is learned. Hold on just a second. And then going back to statistical learning, that's going to be during these critical times when children are acquiring language. There's this statistical reasoning that they do with the syllables and how fast or how much they show up during a sentence. So when someone who doesn't speak the word English or doesn't speak English hears the words like United States of America, those might all kind of go together because they're not used to the flow or the stats of how the syllables flow together. Versus someone who speaks English, we group United States of America into separate things because we have grown up with that and the syllabic tones. Okay, so those statistical learnings have to happen, or they tend to occur during those critical stages when we're able to pick up on the differences of the syllables. And the very last, I think I said this before. I remember I added one more slide. This is on linguistic competence, and it's not in your book, but it's in my AP book. And so linguistic competence refers to the idea that we're able to produce and understand things that we've never heard before. So to be competent linguistically would be to say that I can hear a sentence or see a sentence I've never seen before, and it still makes sense. And the example in your book is this kind of crazy sentence, but it says Karl Marx was playing bridge with Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and Mary Queen of Scots when Tarzan walked in. Never encountered that sentence before. Has very little meaning to me, but when I know I can pull meaning from it, right? So that would be to be linguistically competent, is that the ability to reduce a sentence I've never heard and to understand a sentence that we've never heard. Okay? Your language part 3 notes are going to be on thinking and language, and they'll be our last notes in our language series. Have a good day.